The Palace of Versailles is a former royal residence located in Versailles, about 12 miles 19 kilometers west of Paris, France. The palace is owned by the French Republic and has since 1995 been managed, under the direction of the French Ministry of Culture, by the public establishment of the Palace, Museum and National Estate of Versailles. 15 million people visit the palace, park, or gardens of Versailles every year, making it one of the most popular tourist attractions in the world. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of paying visitors to the chateau dropped by 75% from 8 million in 2019 to 2 million in 2020. The drop was particularly sharp among foreign visitors, who account for 80% of paying visitors. Louis XIII built a simple hunting lodge on the site of the Palace of Versailles in 1623 and replaced it with a small chateau in 1631-34. Louis XIV expanded the chateau into a palace in several phases from 1661 to 1715. It was a favorite residence for both kings, and in 1682, Louis XIV moved the seat of his court and government to Versailles, making the palace the de facto capital of France. This state of affairs was continued by Kings Louis XV and Louis XVI, who primarily made interior alterations to the palace, but in 1789 the royal family and capital of France returned to Paris. For the rest of the French Revolution, the Palace of Versailles was largely abandoned and emptied of its contents, and the population of the surrounding city plummeted. Napoleon Bonaparte, following his takeover of France, used Versailles as a summer residence from 1810 to 1814, but did not restore it. When the French monarchy was restored, it remained in Paris, and it was not until the 1830s that meaningful repairs were made to the palace. A museum of French history was installed within it, replacing the apartments of the southern wing. The palace and park were designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1979 for its importance as the center of power, art, and science in France during the 17th and 18th centuries. The French Ministry of Culture has placed the palace, its gardens, and some of its subsidiary structures on its list of culturally significant monuments. The Hall of Mirrors is a long gallery at the westernmost part of the palace that looks out onto the gardens. The hall was built from 1678 to 1681 on the site of a terrace Laveau built between the King and Queen's suites. The hall is clad in marble and decorated in a modified version of the Corinthian order, with 578 mirrors facing 17 windows and reflecting the light provided by them. The ceiling fresco, painted by Lebrun over the next 4 years, embellishes the first 18 years of Louis XIV's reign in 30 scenes, 17 of which are military victories over the Dutch. The fresco depicts Louis XIV himself alongside classical figures in the scenes celebrating moments in his reign such as the beginning of personal rule in 1661, breaking from earlier frescoes at Versailles that used allegories derived from classical and mythological scenes. The Salon of War and the Salon of Peace bookend the Hall of Mirrors on its northern and southern ends respectively. The Salon of War, constructed and decorated from 1678 to 1686, celebrates French victories in the Franco-Dutch War with marble panels, gilded bronze trophies of arms, and a stucco bas-relief of Louis XIV on horseback riding over his enemies. The Salon of Peace is decorated in the same fashion but according to its eponymous theme. The Royal Chapel of Versailles is located at the southern end of the north wing. The building stands 40 meter, 130 feet high, and measures 42 meters, 138 feet, long and 24 meters, 79 feet wide. The chapel is rectangular with a semicircular apse, combining traditional, Gothic Royal French church architecture with the French Baroque style of Versailles. The ceiling of the chapel is constituted by an unbroken vault, divided into 3 frescoes by Antoine Coypel, Charles de la Fosse, and Jean Jouvenet. The palette of motifs beneath the frescoes glorify the deeds of Louis IX, and include images of David, Constantine, Charlemagne, and Louis IX, fleur-de-lis, and Louis XIV's monogram. Louis XIV commissioned the chapel, its sixth, from Mansart and Lebrun in 1683-84. It was the last building constructed at Versailles during Louis XIV's reign. Construction was delayed until 1699, however, and it was not completed until 1710. The only major modification to the chapel since its completion was the removal of a lantern from its roof in 1765. A full restoration of the chapel began in late 2017 and lasted into early 2021. The Royal Opera of Versailles was originally commissioned by Louis XIV in 1682 and was to be built at the end of the north wing with a design by Mansart and Vigorani. However, due to the expense of the King's Continental Wars, the project was put aside. The idea was revived by Louis XV with a new design by Ange-Jacques Gabriel in 1748, but this was also temporarily put aside. The project was revived and rushed ahead for the planned celebration of the marriage of the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette. For economy and speed, the new opera was built almost entirely of wood, which also gave it very high-quality acoustics. The wood was painted to resemble marble, and the ceiling was decorated with a painting of the Apollo, the god of the arts, preparing crowns for illustrious artists, by Louis Jean-Jacques de Rameau. The sculptor Augustin Pajou added statuary and reliefs to complete the decoration. The new opera was inaugurated on the 16th of May 1770, as part of the celebration of the royal wedding. In October 1789, early in the French Revolution, the last banquet for the royal guardsmen was hosted by the king in the opera, before he departed for Paris. Following the Franco-German War in 1871 and then the Paris Commune until 1875, the French National Assembly met in the opera, until the proclamation of the Third French Republic and the return of the government to Paris. Shortly after becoming king in 1830, Louis Philippe I decided to transform the palace into a museum devoted to all the glories of France, with paintings and sculpture depicting famous French victories and heroes. Most of the apartments of the palace were entirely demolished. In the main building, practically all of the apartments were annihilated, with only the apartments of the king and queen remaining almost intact, and turned into a series of several large rooms and galleries. The Coronation Room, whose original volume was left untouched by Louis Philippe, which displays the celebrated painting of the coronation of Napoleon I by Jacques-Louis David. The Hall of Battles, commemorating French victories with large-scale paintings, and the 1830 Room, which celebrated Louis Philippe's own coming to power in the French Revolution of 1830. Some paintings were brought from the Louvre, including works depicting events in French history by Philippe de Champagne, Pierre Mignard, Laurent de la Hire, Charles Lebrun, Adam Franz van der Meulen, Nicolas de Largillier, Hyacinthe Rigaud, Jean-Antoine Houdin, Jean-Marc Nadier, Elisabeth Vigée Lebrun, Hubert Robert, Thomas Lawrence, Jacques-Louis David, and Antoine-Jean Gros. Others were commissioned especially for the museum by prominent artists of the early 19th century, including Eugene Delacroix, who painted St. Louis at the French victory over the British in the Battle of Tailbourg in 1242. Other painters featured include Horace Vernet and François Gérard. A monumental painting by Vernet features Louis Philippe himself, with his sons, posing in front of the gates of the palace. The overthrow of Louis Philippe in 1848 put an end to his grand plans for the museum, but the Gallery of Battles is still as it was, and is passed through by many visitors to the royal apartments and grand salons. Another set of rooms on the first floor has been made into galleries on Louis XIV and his court, displaying furniture, paintings, and sculptures. In recent years, 11 rooms on the ground floor between the chapel and the opera have been turned into a history of the palace, with audiovisual displays and models. The construction in 1668-1671 of Lavaux's envelope around the outside of Louis XIII's red brick and white stone chateau added state apartments for the king and the queen. The addition was known at the time as the Chateau Neuf, New Chateau. The Grand Appartements, Grand Apartments, also referred to as the State Apartments, include the Grand Appartement du Roi and the Grand Appartement de la Reine. They occupied the main or principal floor of the Chateau Neuf, with 3 rooms in each apartment facing the garden to the west and 4 facing the garden parterres to the north and south, respectively. The private apartments of the king, the Appartement du Roi and the Petit Appartement du Roi, and those of the queen, the Petit Appartement de la Reine, remained in the Chateau Vieux, Old Chateau. Lavaux's design for the state apartments closely followed Italian models of the day, including the placement of the apartments on the main floor, the piano nobile, the next floor up from the ground level, a convention the architect borrowed from Italian palace design. The king's state apartment consisted of an enfilade of 7 rooms, each dedicated to one of the known planets and their associated titular Roman deity. The queen's apartment formed a parallel enfilade with that of the Grand Appartement du Roi. After the addition of the Hall of Mirrors, 1678-1684, the king's apartment was reduced to 5 rooms, until the reign of Louis XV, when 2 more rooms were added, and the queen's to 4. The Queen's apartments served as the residence of three queens of France: Marie-Thérèse d'Autriche, wife of Louis XIV, Marie Leczinska, wife of Louis XV, and Marie Antoinette, wife of Louis XVI. Additionally, Louis XIV's granddaughter-in-law, Princess Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, Duchess de Bourgogne, wife of the Petit Dauphin, occupied these rooms from 1697, the year of her marriage, to her death in 1712. The Ambassador's staircase, Escalier des Ambassadeurs, was an imperial staircase built from 1674 to 1680 by d'Orbay. Until Louis XV had it demolished in 1752 to create a courtyard for his private apartments, the staircase was the primary entrance into the Palace of Versailles and the royal apartments especially. It was entered from the courtyard via a vestibule that, cramped and dark, contrasted greatly with the tall, open space of the staircase, famously lit naturally with a skylight, so as to overawe visitors. The staircase and walls of the room that contained it were clad in polychrome marble and gilded bronze, with decor in the Ionic order. Lebrun painted the walls and ceiling of the room according to a festive theme to celebrate Louis XIV's victory in the Franco-Dutch War. On the wall immediately above the staircase were trompe-l'oeil paintings of people from the four parts of the world looking into the staircase over a balustrade, a motif repeated on the ceiling fresco. There they were joined by allegorical figures for the 12 months of the year and various classical Greek figures such as the Muses. A marble bust of Louis XIV, sculpted by Jean Warren in 1665-66, was placed in a niche above the first landing of the staircase. In 1623, Louis XIII, King of France, built a hunting lodge on a hill in a favorite hunting ground, 12 miles 19 kilometers west of Paris, and 10 miles 16 kilometers from his primary residence, the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The site, near a village named Versailles, was a wooded wetland that Louis XIII's court scorned as being generally unworthy of a king. One of his courtiers, François de Bassompierre, wrote that the lodge would not inspire vanity in even the simplest gentleman. From 1631 to 1634, architect Philibert Leroy replaced the lodge with a chateau for Louis XIII, who forbade his queen, Anne of Austria, from staying there overnight, even when an outbreak of smallpox at Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1641 forced Louis XIII to relocate to Versailles with his 3-year-old heir, the future Louis XIV. When Louis XIII died in 1643, Anne became Louis XIV's regent, and Louis XIII's chateau was abandoned for the next decade. She moved the court back to Paris, where Anne and her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, continued Louis XIII's unpopular monetary practices. This led to the Fronde, a series of revolts against royal authority from 1648 to 1653 that masked a struggle between Mazarin and the princes of the blood, Louis XIV's extended family, for influence over him. In the aftermath of the Fronde, Louis XIV became determined to rule alone. Following Mazarin's death in 1661, Louis XIV reformed his government to exclude his mother and the princes of the blood, moved the court back to Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and ordered the expansion of his father's chateau at Versailles into a palace. Louis XIV had hunted at Versailles in the 1650s, but did not take any special interest in Versailles until 1661. On the 17th of August 1661, Louis XIV was a guest at a sumptuous festival hosted by Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances, at his palatial residence, the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte. Louis XIV was impressed by the chateau and its gardens, which were the work of Louis Lavaux, the court architect since 1654, André Le Notre, the royal gardener since 1657, and Charles Lebrun, a painter in royal service since 1647. Vaux-le-Vicomte's scale and opulence inspired Louis XIV's aesthetic sense, but also led him to imprison Fouquet that September, as he had also built an island fortress and a private army. Louis XIV was also inspired by Vaux-le-Vicomte, and he recruited its authors for his own projects. Louis XIV replaced Fouquet with Jean-Baptiste Colbert, a protégé of Mazarin and enemy of Fouquet, and charged him with managing the corps of artisans in royal employment. Colbert acted as the intermediary between them and Louis XIV, who personally directed and inspected the planning and construction of Versailles.